Good evening, everyone. Today is Thursday, another wonderful day. And again, City Law Solicitor is here to give you the weekly update of the law. Today, I'll be looking at employment law matters. Now, I must say that at the end of my advice or discussion, I will be allowing viewers to phone in with all their legal questions. It is also significant to state here that we are privileged to have a divan of a blue to be hosting City Law Solicitors next week, Thursday. Now, next week, we'll be looking at very hot topical immigration issues. We'll be looking at the point-based system, which came into force in January 2021. Now, with the EU law hasn't become extinct, I'm sure that most of us will be looking at how our families can join us in the UK. And more importantly, those who are professionals such as nurses, teachers, engineers, technicians, IT, and all kinds of professionals all over the world who are seeking to migrate to the UK and to live here permanently. So if you are one of these categories, or if your family member is one of these people, I would advise you that don't mix our Thursday show for next week, which will be hosted by Beyebenwo. Having said this, I will want to go into what I want to discuss today. As I've said today, I'll be looking at employment law matters. And I'll be looking at three areas. I'll be looking at who is an employee, who is a worker, and who is self-employed. These three individuals have very distinct obligations, rights, and benefits at the workplace. I'll be starting with employee. When we say employee, under the Employment Rights Act 1996, Section 230, subsection 1, it is someone who works under the contract of the employer. That contract can be implied, or that contract can be stated in writing. Contract can also be implied, but it's obvious that under the law, employees are entitled to terms of statement. So sometimes you could be an employee, but you might not have a contract. It does not mean that you don't have rights at your workplace. Now, I have chosen this area to discuss with you today because after the coronavirus, employers have shifted, or there has been a lot of different ways of recruiting and working. So employers have changed the ways of engaging individuals in providing services for them. And this depends on what employers are seeking to achieve. So there is always a contention between the employer and employee. Obviously, employers are there to maximize their profit at the expense sometimes of the employees. The employees are there also to maximize their wages and their rights so that they can be entitled to all the statutory rights. But these employees can only claim these rights if they are aware of these fundamental rights at the workplace. This is where city law solicitors comes in. So, when you are an employee, as I've already defined, you have various rights. Of course, there is also an obligation. You have obligation to perform your tasks at the control of the employer, which means that the employer determines when you should come to work and what tasks you should perform. But more importantly, you also have various rights. And these rights are sometimes cumulative, or they are just automatic rights that are accrued to anyone who is engaged right from the first day. The first right is a right not to be unfairly dismissed. Of course, this is a qualified right which is available to those who have been employed under the UK law for 2 years or more. And I'm going to explain this further when I've looked at all the 3 categories of individuals that I've already mentioned. Now, it is quite clear from what I've said so far that being an employee is a well-cherished status. There are also those who can be called workers. Now, workers, unlike employees, could vary depending on how their services are provided. The services will determine whether someone is a worker or is self-employed. Now, when we say somebody is a worker, it's someone who also provides personal services to the employer. And those services are provided to the employer not as a client. So in this case, the employer is not a client. So there's a distinction between someone who is providing professional service to the employer and getting remuneration as a customer to the employer, and then the employer being the client. But a fundamental factor in determining who is employer is substitution and mutual obligation. Now, when I say substitution, what I mean here is that if you are a worker, then it's obvious that you may not be able to nominate your wife or your child or your daughter or your son to go and perform that duty for you at the workplace because you are a worker. Though you may not have a contract of employment, just like an employee. You also have what they call mutual obligation, and that simply means that you are obliged to accept offers of jobs and directions from the employer, and the employer is also obliged to provide you jobs. Now, which means that some people, even though may be called self-employed by employers, in reality, these people are workers. But I don't want to bore you with case laws, but I would just want to mention 2 case laws which have become very, very topical, and I'm sure most of you watching and listening to me today are quite familiar. It's a case of Primiko versus Mr. Smith, wherein Mr. Smith was categorized as a self-employed person. She was obliged to carry the ID card of Primiko, which you all know is a plumbing company, carry the ID card, use their car and paid for it, and also was also supposed to provide services that could not be provided by another person except himself, because they were relying on his professional qualification for that service. Now, when Mr. Smith had issues with Pimlico Services and wanted to make a claim for some of the statutory benefits that I'll come into after I look at all these three areas, Pimlico Services tried to exclude him on the basis that he was self-employed. But the court found that he was a worker on the basis that he was offering services that was mutually exclusive. And again, he was also under the control of Pimlico Services because he could not substitute anyone to perform those tasks on his behalf. The more recent case is the case of Uber versus Islam, where Uber have sought to categorize their drivers as all self-employed. And the court found that those drivers are workers in the sense that even though they are using their platform, they are relying on their professional driving skills. They could not just log on the platform and allow a different driver to drive the car on their behalf. They receive the passenger fares on their behalf, and they pay them weekly wages, or what they would have called the invoices. So, having looked at this, it means that most of us may be wrongly categorized as self-employed, but in reality, we are workers. So I looked at who is then self-employed. Now, a self-employed person is normally a contractor who just takes jobs from the employer, provide that services, and it could be long-term, but of course, this self-employed person could sometimes even nominate another person to perform that task on his behalf because he's self-employed, and especially when he's providing that service under an umbrella company. But why this is so important for our discussion today, it is the statutory rights that is attributed to all these status. Now, as I have said, when you are an employee, I'm going to take you through most of your statutory right. Now, the first statutory right, as I've said, is the right not to be dismissed. Another right is a right for you to be entitled to the minimum wage. The third right is a right for you to be entitled to annual leave. The fourth right is the right to be entitled to statutory sick pay. The fourth right, for those of us, for our wives and girlfriends and women in general, is your right to maternity leave. So all these rights are available to those who are employees. And that is why it is so significant for one to establish his status at the workplace, whether or not that person is a worker or an employee. Now, for those people who are workers, sadly, you guys don't have the right not to be unfairly dismissed. Which means that for workers, you could simply lose your job within the slip of tongue. But however, workers are equally entitled to certain rights. Rights not to be discriminated at the workplace, right not to be victimized at the workplace, and above all, right to the minimum wage. So when you are a worker, you are more or less entitled to almost the same right as an employee, with the exception of right not to be unfairly dismissed. And as I look at the case of Mr. Smith versus Pimlico, even though the court found that he had basis for bringing a claim for discrimination, unlawful deduction of wages because he was receiving wages. The court found that he was not entitled to claim that he was unfairly dismissed because he was a worker. So it means that being an employee, it is the best out of all these three in terms of statutory rights. But for those of you who are self-employed, of course, I'm sure that it comes with tax benefits because you have full control of how to manage and manipulate your taxes. However, self-employed are not entitled to annual leave. They are not entitled to minimum wage because you could simply take a contract and you might end up doing more hours than perhaps somebody being a worker or employee will be entitled to. And you also don't have a right not to be unfairly dismissed. So it means that your contract could be terminated even though in law, under civil law, you may be entitled to breach of contract if you have fully drafted a contract or entered into a contract with the employer. And further, which is one significant factor, is the issue of vicarious liability. Now, one employer or a worker commits an offense at the workplace or causes an injury to someone at the workplace. The employer is vicariously liable for the act of that employee or the worker. Now, if a contractor ever caused the same injury, that contractor will be liable, solely liable for the injuries of that person, which means that that contractor may be liable for compensation against that person that has suffered injury as a result of the activities of that contractor or self-employed person. So these are the various areas that I wanted to look at today. Now, clearly, it brings to bear that if we say a worker, then there could be different categories of workers. And of course, in the past, employers have sought to reduce or to minimize or to dilute the right of workers by either engaging them through agencies or through an umbrella companies or through bank staff. Those of you who are nurses are clearly very familiar with what we call bank staff. Now, all these three categories of individuals that I've just mentioned, they are equally workers. They are workers in the sense that they provide personal services to the employer. But I want to make this point quite clear. I know most of you sometimes are asked not to come to work even though you may have worked with them, that employer, or you might have been providing your services to the employer through an agency for more than 2 years. So it is clear that sometimes employers or businesses engage in sham arrangement with agencies to dilute the right of these workers. So first, if you are an agency staff and you have provided your service through the agency through a business for 2 years or more, then clearly you may have a right not to be unfairly dismissed. So if after providing your service to that business through an agency for 2 years or more, and that business decides that you should not come to that workplace again, as sad as that might be, you may be entitled to unfair dismissal claim in the tribunal. And I'm going to take my time to explain this because I know that most of you may have suffered some of these problems at the workplace. And I say this with experience because one of my clients who was working for an NHS service was with them through an agency for some time, and then through no fault of hers, she was dismissed. Now the point is that when someone is dismissed and that person is obviously providing his or her service to that business through an agency, that person have two candidates to pursue claim of unfair dismissal against them. The first claim is through that agency, and the second claim is to be joined to the business that what we call end users. The end user of your service is a person that you are directly providing the service to through that agency. So the tribunal will be entitled to investigate and to find out whether or not there is a sham arrangement between the agency and that end user, which is the business or the employer you are providing your service to. And on that basis, the tribunal can come to the conclusion that perhaps there is a sham arrangement, and therefore you may have a claim against that end user, which is the company or the business you have been providing the service to, which through no fault of yours may have just asked you not to come to work again. In those circumstances, you will be entitled to right to unfair dismissal and compensation in the tribunal. Now, as I said in the beginning, today I am going to interpret most of these things in Twi language, because I know that most of my sisters and brothers have been urging me to try to explain some of these things in Twi so that they can equally benefit from this advice. Therefore, the man can say, and then now me per se, me twi na adwen eba niama ye koso adwuma. Adwuma ya ye umu, ye fo bi no employees, ye fo bi mo workers, and ye fo bi mo nso self-employed. No mu nyina nso no, obiara wo what they call writer, which is obiara wo ade a adwuma mu hono no, eni se bi omodidi no. Enti bi adwuma mu hono awo no, so why adwuma be 2 years. Na normally no, omo from employees no, omo a omo sign contract with the employer no. Enti sanye bi as a cleaning and answer adwuma bi na we na say sign contract. Na just say contract of employment only pa kona sign. E ma we employee, we so no match so we employee. So we employee now we adwuma 2 years or more. Na just say omo ntumi nyi wadi just like that. So mu yi wadi no mo amfa kwan papa so anyi wadi a obetumi e do ma akọ tribunal na wa gisika afio mo ho no mo. Eno na ye lawyers a ye wokum ha say, especially city law solicitors, ye bam na ye boa sa nkofo no. Adwuma ye ne bebre na ho no ma ye no sade be ya ye ngi musika na emu se de asam ne court na court no bua na sika no be council kakra ye so beta fro na wo de amaye. And I was monsoon so I from workers. If you want ma na bia adwuma na oye no o mo sign contract so your worker ono kwa bia na on kinda onim ya didi mu bebre. And am say bia oye worker no I actual contract no so na wonim no. I can now kwaya na manager and supervisor say me adwuma mu ha bi. Ya kan sa na so na obi hu lawyer bi so ana. And I'm said the way of actual contract only right to unfair dismissal. And also I be another acquire into me well. And I especially more ya farmer to more need 2 years no. Me bomb koko. Chrome has say a man say ya farmer jumum. Now juma no want to na jumum for 2 years sir. Anytime be a supervisor make us a coffee no. Say a kwan of fast you odi no. Eh papa say e boni mu. To me them find them court because emrana de aba na kire say woni mfie mi no wadwuma mu hono ma enya ade a eyi wadi a obetime de akokot enti the best remo says o wadwuma mu hono mo na mpo na say adwuma no pese wo ye ko akiri na say edi wani a si abotre because emre pi no on be di wani because o munim say woni mfie mi no wadwuma nu Then I'm saying, if you mean with moon, so which man for coin bonus where you waiting. To be one man, mamma, wait moon. Say, I'm way here, Juman as a supervisor and a hammer, moon see about tray. We say, why I want that 1 year need 2 years, when I tie hammer. Because in himself, what dear, you might declare now, and ya there will be a very almost free, and riding on we in. Now, me church him was in some way, so now I can say. But who also so or you're self-employed. No more me self-employed, I said, dear, or mono. I say, be a more care any idea, who also under self-employed. We are self-employed, I are not well, tax in the idea because we don't go on over your tax, no BBR. And you be a cow, boy, now, which means I can't walk home, not the jack amount, walk on. I'm a seeker or profit, no, aqua form. And in a bear now tax and aqua to work. Name says, and well, says, oh, you're self-employed now, the Tiana say. Say, Echima, a man for a man, my hobby, ma. Won't mean your more free. Because we need the same right to say, you'll be a man of contract of employment or ye, Chimano. A beer, the obey to my and say, be a man fan and say, so when no man sign a contract, not say contract, no, or man far quite no more preaching, and a ja, be a wit with your mark or court. Now I can say, contract have no more sign. One family acquires no maternity contract in Tino, more breaking into no so be entitled to compensation. But apart from that, no, and pray Pino, Yanamo signs our contract now we are self-employed and we are care near dear. And the announcers some best say, so was that to be now we are Jumana. Nas will be a fan of Jumuna on our contract, one and your pet. And this are some banner say, Moody Asamna, and answer you do a near. And then you be so year ready so very sweet Jumana, I know see a betray. Because a Jumana, Uncle Foyam, I will be a ne category on the status, and will be a ne emra, or also ultimately gnasso at the year Jumano. Instead of Master Church in Muno. Sana me person made to move for ne. Namaka way in our wheel. Wa, when you do problems, sir. Here you were the unfalcon person. And now, what a jump for a hound. Yes, Remo. City law solicitors, you has say, a very boy in Miano. And yes, you can come. You might be bringing a no we know if you, which means I do case never, Nansa, you beer. Yes, sure. Nansa, a sincere Musi Sua, a big ginum, na bow. Sican never bow on Emo, a jar. I say, dear. Or Yama, dear, no, Ed our better friend in Saho, like a crab announce once you make a cat after, and so I say. And the Empress I can say, and let a jumum in some, and I had a bet to Jamam. About next week Thursday, I need to give a bet to Nancy. They are church and congregation same. More per se, Mukunum teachers for near the acquaintance of Hodo be nurses for Mamma nurses for near the and a corner of Hodo be on more. Who made me fast with their back room, almost having your one citron. The best tree of boys now church moving next week. And he got come back and say, Madame Muna say, what tear me? Now, and maybe I not Thursday, you know. Yeah, in city law solicitors, move follow Facebook, and I say YouTube now, your Hanum, say it to move. Listeners, I want to thank you all for watching us tonight. We are here every Thursday at 8 p.m. We are encouraging you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are encouraging you to follow me, Thomas Beyebenwo, as one of the solicitors of City Law Solicitors on Facebook. We are encouraging you to share our videos so that your friends and families can also benefit from this free advice. Today, I have decided to open the phone lines for those of you who are watching to call in for advice and any legal question, any legal matter. You can phone in. The phone lines are on the screen. I'll be here to answer your phone calls and give you that advice, especially on the employment law that I have just discussed. Hello.
Evening.
Hello, caller.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. You don't have to mention your name. You can just ask your question, please.
Okay. I have a question, but it's not on immigration. It's not on employment. It's on immigration.
What is
Hello,
your
can you hear me?
What is your
Please, I'm
question?
outside. Yeah, I have a family friend that wants to come to UK from abroad.
Okay. What does he do for a living? What does your family friend does for a living?
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
What does he do for a living?
She's a doctor.
Well,
She's a
ask
she's a
your
doctor. She wants to come, but
ask
we
your
don't know how to
family
go about it.
ask your family friend to join us next week. We'll be discussing the points-based system, which allows professionals to migrate to the UK with the intention to settle here permanently. So next week, 8 p.m. Thursday, we'll be discussing this extensively. So your family member can follow City Law Solicitors either on YouTube or Facebook, and then we'll be able to give advice accordingly.
Okay, thank you.